Some crowns only look right on women who still matter, Celeste Monroe whispered, and Eleanor Whitmore felt the sentence cut through the ballroom before the first violin note had finished rising. The Rose Crown Foundation Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel with gold light, crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes, black tuxedos, and gowns that moved like silk shadows across the polished floor. Outside, Manhattan glittered beneath a cold spring rain, the hotel windows holding the city in silver streaks. But inside, everything had been made to look warm, generous, and perfect. White roses climbed the sponsor wall. A charity auction table displayed pearl earrings, signed first editions, and weekend stays in places most people only saw in magazines. At the center of a velvet-covered pedestal near the stage sat the diamond rose tiara, its petals shaped from old-cut stones, its silver branches curved like frozen light. It was not large. It did not need to be. Every woman in the ballroom knew it was the symbol of the evening, the rose crown given each year to the honoree whose work had kept the foundation alive. Eleanor had seen that tiara only once before, in Margaret Hayes's office, resting inside a navy velvet box while Margaret cried quietly over a stack of scholarship applications they finally had enough money to approve. Now the box was open in the ballroom, and Celeste had lifted the crown from it. She stood before a tall, gilded mirror, her pale pink gown catching the chandelier light, one hand carefully holding the tiara above her dark waves while the other rested on Preston Whitmore's sleeve. Preston stood beside her in a black tuxedo, handsome, still, and silent. Not surprised, not embarrassed, silent in the way that had ended more of their marriage than any argument ever had. Eleanor stopped beneath the archway, her midnight blue gown simple against the glittering room, her coat still held by the attendant behind her. A few guests recognized her, and then looked away too quickly, the way people do when they have already chosen comfort over truth. Celeste saw her reflection in the mirror before turning around. Her smile did not change. It only became sharper. "Eleanor," she said, sweet enough for witnesses. "We were only seeing how it photographs." The photographer near the sponsor wall lowered his camera by half an inch. Margaret Hayes was not yet on stage. The program had not begun. The crown was not supposed to be touched by anyone but the chairwoman and the honoree. Eleanor knew that. Preston knew that. Celeste knew enough to enjoy not caring. "It is beautiful," Celeste continued, letting the tiara hover close to her hair. "Though honestly, some traditions need a fresher face." A woman near the auction table looked down at her glass. Someone gave a nervous laugh and immediately regretted it. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she did not step forward. She did not reach for the crown. She did not ask Preston to stop what he had already permitted. Her eyes moved from Celeste's fingers on the diamond petals to Preston's expression, waiting for the smallest correction, one word, one gesture, one sign that even now he remembered whose years, whose checks, whose late-night calls had carried this foundation when donors disappeared and shelters nearly closed. He gave her nothing. Celeste lowered the tiara just enough for the diamonds to touch her hair. "You understand, do you not?" she said softly. "A gala needs to show the future." Eleanor felt the ballroom dim around the edges, though the chandeliers still burned above her. On the velvet pedestal, the empty crown box waited like a mouth that had lost its name. The crown had never been only a crown to Eleanor. Long before the ballroom lights, the champagne trays, the sponsor wall, and Celeste's hand lifting diamonds toward a mirror, the rose crown had sat in a small office on West 53rd Street, inside a navy velvet box with worn corners and a broken clasp. The foundation had been close to closing then. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, there were still luncheon photos, donor newsletters, and careful words about restructuring. Privately, there were unpaid shelter invoices, scholarship checks waiting in a drawer, legal aid appointments marked tentative because no one knew whether the attorneys could be paid past June. Eleanor remembered that afternoon with a clarity that still lived under her skin. She was 30, newly married to Preston, wearing a gray wool coat because the heat in Margaret Hayes's office barely worked. Rain had tapped against the window unit while Margaret sat across from her, removing her glasses with a hand that trembled from exhaustion rather than age. "If we cannot bridge the next quarter," Margaret had said, "we lose the housing program first, then the scholarships, then the emergency fund." Eleanor had looked down at the folder between them. Inside were names, not statistics. A mother in Queens trying to finish nursing school. Two sisters from New Jersey who needed relocation support after their father died. A 19-year-old who had aged out of foster care and wanted to study accounting. The pages smelled faintly of printer ink and coffee. Eleanor could still remember the sound of Margaret's old radiator clicking while she turned each sheet. Preston had told her not to get too involved then. He said foundations were sentimental machines that consumed money and produced gratitude no one could measure. But Eleanor had sat in that office and seen something he could not understand, the quiet architecture of survival. She signed the first emergency grant that evening with a blue pin Margaret kept in a chipped mug beside the phone. She asked for no press release, no quote, no portrait on the wall. She asked only that the shelter doors remain open through winter and that the scholarship checks go out on time. A week later, the Hartwell Endowment funds were transferred. A month later, the legal aid clinic reopened 2 evenings a week. By spring, the foundation had stabilized enough to rebuild its donor board, though Eleanor still made the calls Preston later claimed were his introductions. She sat through late meetings, reviewed budgets line by line, and wrote notes by hand to women who would never know the donor who kept their applications from being denied. The rose crown became part of that work almost by accident. Margaret showed it to her one night after a board meeting, lifting it from the velvet box with both hands. "It belonged to our founder," she said. "We give it only when someone has protected the mission itself." Eleanor had touched one diamond petal lightly and thought it felt less like jewelry than responsibility made visible. Years later, Preston learned to stand beside her at galas and speak warmly about the foundation's future. He enjoyed the photographs, the handshakes, the applause that surrounded work he had never stayed late enough to do. Eleanor let him share the light because she still believed marriage meant generosity. Now, in the Astoria Grand Ballroom, watching Celeste lower that same crown toward her hair, Eleanor understood how easily generosity became erasure when given to someone who only knew how to take. Celeste did not place the crown fully on her head at first. She let it hover there, close enough for the diamonds to brush her hair, far enough to pretend it was only play if anyone important objected. The photographer near the sponsor wall raised his camera again after a hesitation, and Celeste turned her face slightly toward the light, practicing the angle of a woman who believed beauty could become legitimacy if enough lenses agreed. Preston watched beside her, one hand around a champagne flute, his black tuxedo immaculate, his expression controlled in the way Eleanor had once mistaken for elegance. Now she knew it was calculation. Celeste laughed softly when the first flash went off. "Just a test," she said, though her eyes stayed on Eleanor. "The committee will need fresh images eventually." The phrase fresh images drifted through the ballroom like perfume covering smoke. Eleanor stood near the archway, her midnight blue gown catching only the edge of the chandelier light. Behind her, an attendant still held her coat, unsure whether to step away or disappear. A few guests moved closer to the auction table, pretending to study the pearl earrings while watching through reflections in the glass display. Celeste lowered the tiara back toward the velvet box, but did not release it. Her fingers stayed around the silver branches. "Preston said the foundation is entering a new chapter," she continued. "I suppose every chapter needs a new face." Preston's mouth tightened almost invisibly, but he did not correct her. That silence opened something in the room. It gave Celeste permission to go further. "Eleanor was wonderful for the old image," Celeste said, smiling with practiced gentleness. "The former face of the foundation." The words struck harder because they were spoken politely. Former, face, foundation. 3 words arranged like a ribbon around an erasure. Eleanor looked at Preston then, not pleading, not accusing, only giving him the final chance to remember that dignity sometimes depends on one small public truth. He could have said Eleanor is still on the board. He could have said that crown is not for photographs. He could have said her work built this night. Instead, he lifted his glass and spoke in a low voice meant to smooth the air without changing it. "Eleanor, let us not make the gala uncomfortable." The same old sentence in different clothes. "Let us not make dinner uncomfortable. Let us not make the board uncomfortable. Let us not make donors uncomfortable." Translation: accept the wound quietly so the room can remain beautiful for everyone else. Eleanor felt tears gather, slow and hot, but they did not fall. Her mother had taught her long ago that composure was not the absence of pain. It was pain refusing to become entertainment. She turned her gaze from Preston to the Foundation logo printed in gold on the program near the pedestal, a rose wrapped around an open door. She knew what that door had meant when the shelter could not pay rent. She knew what the rose had meant when scholarship letters went out to young women who had never owned a formal dress, let alone a crown. Celeste saw her looking and lifted the tiara again, this time allowing it to settle lightly into her hair. The photographer's flash brightened the diamonds. A guest gave a small nervous laugh. Preston did nothing. Across the ballroom, near the stage stairs, Margaret Hayes paused with the official gold program in her hand. She saw the empty velvet box. She saw Celeste wearing the crown before the ceremony. Then she saw Eleanor standing still beneath the archway, wounded but unbent, and Margaret's expression changed from hostess warmth to chairwoman certainty. Eleanor had already closed the doors Preston thought were still open. She had done it 3 months earlier, after the separation became official enough for attorneys and quiet enough for society women to begin choosing which lunches not to invite her to. There had been no scandalous statement, no interview, no wounded photograph released through a friend of a friend. Eleanor simply returned to the Rose Crown Foundation office on West 53rd Street, hung her midnight coat on the same bent brass hook by Margaret Hayes's door, and asked for the binders Preston had stopped pretending to understand. The office looked smaller than the gala would look tonight, but it was there, under fluorescent lights and aging ceiling tiles, that the foundation actually survived. Donation pledges, shelter budgets, scholarship renewals, media requests, sponsor agreements, gala seating charts, honoree protocols. Eleanor read them all, page by page, with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her and rain pressing against the window. Preston's name appeared everywhere it should not have. Not as a donor of record, not as a program founder, not as a board officer, but as a social shortcut. A corporate sponsor invited through Preston. A press interview routed through Preston. A reserved photo moment approved because Preston requested it. Celeste Monroe listed as a special guest beside his name, then as guest liaison in one draft, then as prospective gala ambassador in another document someone had been too uncomfortable to finalize. Eleanor did not cry over the files. That part of grief had already happened in quieter rooms. In the foundation office, she felt something cleaner than heartbreak. She felt responsibility. By that evening, she and Margaret had rewritten the access protocols. Donor authority returned to the board and principal patrons. Media approval required chairwoman sign-off. Stage presence was restricted to official honorees, foundation officers, and program speakers. The rose crown could not leave its velvet box until the ceremony began. Only Margaret Hayes, as chairwoman, could place it on the honoree named in the official gold program. No spouse, guest, sponsor, companion, or public relations representative could borrow it for photographs, promotional materials, or private introductions. Eleanor signed the revised protocol with a steady hand. Margaret watched from across the desk, her expression soft with both gratitude and sorrow. "You should not have had to protect the foundation from your own husband," she said. Eleanor closed the binder gently. "The foundation was here before his image needed it," she replied. "It will remain after." She did not say Preston's name again that night. Instead, she checked the scholarship transfer dates, approved emergency housing funds for 2 families in Queens, and wrote a note to the legal aid director about expanding evening appointments. The work steadied her. It reminded her that dignity was not a posture for ballrooms. It was what happened when no one photographed the room and someone still chose to do the right thing. Now, back inside the Astoria Grand Ballroom, as Celeste stood near the mirror with the diamond rose tiara resting against her hair, all of those signatures waited beneath the gold foil program in Margaret's hand. Celeste believed she was trying on a crown. Preston believed silence could still smooth over theft when the object looked beautiful enough. Eleanor knew better. The rules had already been restored. The only thing left was for the room to hear them aloud. Margaret Hayes had learned to recognize misuse before it became scandal. It was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like a hand resting too long on a donor's chair, a sponsor stepping too close to a podium, a guest pretending a borrowed ribbon gave her authority over the room. Tonight, it looked like Celeste Monroe standing beneath the chandeliers with the diamond rose tiara touching her hair, while Eleanor Whitmore stood near the archway with tears held carefully behind her eyes. Margaret stopped at the stage stairs with the official gold program in one hand and the evening script in the other. For a moment, the ballroom continued around her. Champagne passing on silver trays, photographers adjusting lenses, guests murmuring beneath the sound of violins, rain drawing soft gray lines down the hotel windows. Then her gaze moved to the velvet pedestal. The navy box was open, empty. The rose crown was not inside it. Margaret's fingers closed around the program. She had chaired the Rose Crown Foundation for 22 years, long enough to know that symbols survived only when people protected their meaning. The crown was not a prop. It was not a social accessory, not a press moment, not an ornament for a woman standing beside a wealthy man. It had been placed on survivors, nurses, attorneys, shelter founders, widows who rebuilt programs from nothing, donors who gave without asking for applause. This year, after a unanimous board vote, it belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret opened the program slowly, though she already knew what it said. The gold foil page caught the light. Rose Crown Queen Honoree, Eleanor Whitmore. Principal Patron. Scholarship Founder. Shelter Restoration Donor. Emergency Legal Aid Benefactor. Beneath it was a short paragraph Eleanor had tried to reduce twice because she hated praise that took attention away from the women served by the foundation. Margaret remembered Eleanor sitting in the office 3 months earlier, pale from the separation, still asking whether the shelter transfer had cleared before she asked whether Preston had removed Celeste from the media list. That was who Eleanor was. Even wounded, she checked the doors first. Across the ballroom, Celeste laughed for the camera, one hand lifting toward the tiara as if she had been born beneath it. Preston stood beside her, not touching the crown, not stopping it, allowing the image to form. Margaret saw his silence and understood its purpose. He wanted the room to adjust to the lie before the truth could object. A younger event coordinator hurried toward her, eyes wide with panic hidden beneath professional makeup. "Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, "should I retrieve the tiara?" Margaret did not look away from the scene. No, the coordinator froze. Margaret closed the program with a quiet snap. "Do not touch her. Do not create a spectacle before the foundation speaks." The coordinator swallowed and nodded. Margaret handed her the evening script. "Have the photographer stop shooting. Tell the stage manager we begin in 2 minutes. Bring the velvet box to the podium." "And Ms. Monroe?" the coordinator asked. Margaret's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor, still standing beneath the archway, still refusing to make her pain into entertainment. "Ms. Monroe may keep believing whatever Mr. Whitmore allowed her to believe," Margaret said softly. "For 2 more minutes." She stepped away from the stage stairs and walked toward the podium with the gold program against her chest. The violins shifted into the ceremony cue. The ballroom lights began to lower. Celeste was still smiling when the first spotlight found the microphone, unaware that the crown on her hair had already been corrected by the name printed in Margaret's hand. Celeste did not understand that the room had already begun turning away from her. She felt the lights lower and mistook the hush for anticipation. She stood beside the gilded mirror with the diamond rose tiara still resting in her hair, one hand touching its silver branches as if she had practiced the gesture in private for weeks. The photographer had stopped taking pictures, but she assumed he was waiting for the ceremony cue. The guests near the sponsor wall had grown quieter, but she thought silence meant attention. Preston remained beside her, his champagne glass untouched now, his eyes following Margaret Hayes as she crossed toward the podium with the gold program held firmly against her chest. For the first time that evening, uncertainty moved across his face, slight but visible to anyone who knew how he hid fear beneath polish. Celeste did not see it. She turned toward a woman in emerald satin and smiled. "I think they are beginning," she said. "Preston told me tonight would mark a new chapter." The woman gave a polite smile and looked away. Celeste adjusted the tiara again, letting the diamonds catch the shifting stage light. "A new queen for a new era," she added softly, but the words floated into a room that no longer received them warmly. Eleanor stood near the far side of the ballroom, just beyond the first row of round tables, beneath a wash of amber light that made her midnight blue gown look almost black. Her eyes were still, bright, but her chin remained lifted. She had not moved toward Celeste. She had not asked for the crown. She had not corrected a single guest. Her stillness had become stronger than protest. The attendant had finally taken her coat away, leaving her shoulders bare beneath the chandelier glow, elegant and vulnerable in the way only someone truly wounded can look when she refuses to collapse. Preston glanced at her once, then looked away quickly, as if her composure accused him more clearly than anger would have. "Celeste," he said under his breath, "perhaps take it off before Margaret begins." Celeste's smile tightened. "Why?" "Because the protocol may be more formal than I thought." She laughed quietly, but her hand froze near the crown. "You said it was symbolic. You said the foundation needed a brighter image." Preston did not answer fast enough. That pause was the first crack. Celeste looked toward the stage, then toward Eleanor, then back at Preston. "You did tell them, did you not?" His silence was smaller now, less powerful, but no less ugly. The violins faded into a single held note. Servers stepped back from the aisles. The sponsor wall lights dimmed, and a spotlight opened on the podium where Margaret Hayes stood with the microphone waiting. An event coordinator arrived at the edge of the stage carrying the empty navy velvet box. Celeste saw it then. The box. The official one. Open and waiting. Her fingers touched the tiara again, but the gesture no longer looked graceful. It looked uncertain. Eleanor watched from the edge of the ballroom, breathing slowly, hands folded before her. The crown was still on the wrong head, but the room had stopped pretending not to know. Margaret opened the gold program, lifted her eyes toward the crowd, and let the silence become formal. Margaret Hayes did not begin with Celeste. That was the first sign the room understood more than it wanted to admit. The spotlight held the podium in a circle of white gold light, while the rest of the ballroom settled into a darker shimmer of gowns, tuxedos, champagne, and turned faces. Celeste stood just off the stage with the rose crown still resting in her hair, her hand now lowered to her side, no longer touching the diamonds as if touch could confirm permission. Preston stood beside her, his posture careful, his smile held too tightly for comfort. Cameras waited near the sponsor wall, but no one lifted one. The photographer who had captured Celeste moments earlier kept his lens pointed at the floor, suddenly aware that some images became evidence before they became publicity. Eleanor remained near the first row, not in the center, not under the brightest light, but visible enough for anyone looking with honesty. Her midnight blue gown caught a narrow edge of the stage glow. Her eyes were wet, but her chin was steady. Margaret opened the gold program and let the quiet stretch one breath longer than ceremony required. "Every year," she said into the microphone, "the Rose Crown Foundation honors one woman whose work has protected the mission when applause was absent." The words moved through the ballroom with deliberate grace. Celeste's expression smoothed itself into anticipation again, though uncertainty had already reached her eyes. Preston looked down at the program in his own hand for the first time that evening, as if the printed truth might have changed while he was not reading it. Margaret continued, "This crown is not a costume. It is not a photo opportunity. It is not given for youth, beauty, proximity, or social convenience." A ripple passed through the room, soft as silk dragged across the floor. Celeste's fingers curled slightly against her gown. The tiara, which had looked dazzling in the mirror, now looked strangely heavy. Margaret turned one page. The gold foil flashed beneath the stage lights. "It is given to the woman who kept shelter doors open when funding failed. To the woman who rebuilt a scholarship program after donors walked away. To the woman who gave without asking that her name be placed on the wall." Eleanor lowered her eyes then, not from shame, but because memory had weight. She saw again the office on West 53rd Street, Margaret's trembling hand, the folder of names, the first emergency grant, the legal aid clinic reopening after dark. Celeste glanced at Preston. "What is she doing?" she whispered. Preston did not answer. His face had lost the softness he used for cameras. Margaret lifted her gaze from the program and looked across the ballroom, past the sponsor wall, past the donors, past Preston and Celeste, directly to Eleanor. In that look, there was apology, gratitude, and a quiet promise that the room would not be allowed to steal what her silence had protected. "Tonight's honoree," Margaret said, and the microphone made the words feel carved into the air, was selected by unanimous board vote, confirmed under the restored stage protocol, and recorded in the official program before this evening began. The event coordinator stepped forward at the side of the stage holding the empty navy velvet box with both hands. Celeste's breath caught visibly. She reached toward the tiara, then stopped, as if removing it too quickly would confess what wearing it had already revealed. Preston finally leaned toward her. "Take it off," he whispered. The command came too late to sound protective. It sounded afraid. Eleanor heard none of it clearly. The ballroom had narrowed to the microphone, the crown, the open velvet box, and Margaret's eyes still fixed on her. The chairwoman turned the gold program outward just enough for the first row to see the printed name. Then she spoke again, slower this time, giving the truth the dignity of arrival. "Eleanor Whitmore," Margaret Hayes said, and the name did not fall into the ballroom. It rose. For one suspended second, no one clapped, not because they disagreed, but because the truth had entered too cleanly for the room to react at once. The spotlight shifted away from the mirror, away from Celeste, away from Preston's carefully arranged silence, and found Eleanor standing near the first row in her midnight blue gown. Her eyes lifted slowly. The wet brightness in them caught the light, but no tear fell. Margaret held the gold program open at the podium, the printed name visible to the guests closest to the stage. "This year's Rose Crown Queen is Eleanor Whitmore, principal patron of the Rose Crown Foundation, founder of the Scholarship Restoration Fund, donor to the Winter Shelter Renewal Program, and benefactor of our expanded emergency legal aid clinic." The applause began as a small, stunned sound near the scholarship table, then widened across the ballroom until it filled the chandeliers. Guests stood. Chairs moved softly against the polished floor. A woman in the second row pressed one hand to her chest. Someone who had looked away from Eleanor earlier now clapped with eyes lowered, as if applause could apologize for silence. Celeste remained near the mirror with the crown still caught in her hair, no longer a symbol of glamour, but evidence of a borrowed honor exposed too late. Her hand rose toward it, then stopped halfway. Every movement now seemed louder than it was. Preston leaned toward her again, his face drained of the warmth he used for cameras. "Take it off," he whispered, but the room had already heard enough from his silence to know that his urgency was not respect. It was fear of being seen. Margaret turned from the podium and nodded once to the event coordinator, who walked toward Celeste with the empty navy velvet box held in both hands. The coordinator did not embarrass her. She simply stopped before her and waited. That courtesy made the moment sharper. Celeste removed the tiara slowly, careful not to pull at her hair, careful not to look at Eleanor, careful not to meet the eyes of the photographer whose camera remained lowered. The diamonds trembled slightly in her hands before she placed the crown into the velvet box. The soft closing of the lid seemed to erase the last illusion she had been wearing. Margaret spoke again, her voice steady over the applause fading into silence. "The Rose Crown is never awarded to the loudest presence in the room. It belongs to the woman who kept showing up when there were no cameras, no donors waiting to be impressed, and no applause to make the work beautiful." Eleanor stood still beneath the spotlight. She could feel Preston looking at her now, finally looking, finally understanding that the foundation he had used as a stage had been standing on her years of work. Celeste stood beside him without the crown, her pale pink gown suddenly too bright, her smile gone, her hands empty. The gold program trembled slightly in Preston's grip when he read the words he should have read before the ceremony began. Principal patron, scholarship founder, shelter restoration donor. The titles were not decorative. They were receipts for nights he had dismissed, calls he had ignored, and compassion he had borrowed when it made him look generous. Margaret stepped down from the podium carrying the navy velvet box toward Eleanor. The ballroom opened around her in a silent path. Eleanor did not move to claim anything. She waited, hands folded, shoulders straight, letting the room come to the truth instead of chasing it. When Margaret reached her, she opened the box. The diamond rose tiara rested inside, returned to silence, waiting now for the only woman in the room who had never needed it to prove who she was. Eleanor did not reach for the crown as if it had been taken from her. That was what made the room grow quieter. Margaret Hayes stood before her with the navy velvet box open, the diamond rose tiara resting inside, like a question the ballroom had finally learned how to ask correctly. Around them, the applause softened into stillness. Preston remained near the mirror beside Celeste, both of them caught in the edge of light, both looking suddenly separate from the glitter they had tried to borrow. Eleanor looked at the crown, then at Margaret, and for a moment the years moved through her with almost unbearable clarity. The cold office on West 53rd Street, the broken clasp on the velvet box, the scholarship names, the shelter invoices, the nights she stayed after meetings to make sure other women would not be left standing outside locked doors. Margaret lifted the tiara with both hands. "For the woman who protected the mission," she said softly, "this time only for Eleanor." Eleanor bowed her head slightly, not in submission, but in respect for the work that had brought them here. The crown settled into her hair with a cool, delicate weight. The diamonds caught the stage light, but they did not change her face. They only revealed what had always been there. The ballroom rose again, not with the stunned applause of a moment exposed, but with something warmer, deeper, almost apologetic. Eleanor walked to the podium beside Margaret, her midnight blue gown moving like a shadow under gold light. She placed one hand on the microphone and waited until the room became completely silent. "This crown does not belong to beauty," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, and clear enough to reach the last table. "It does not belong to marriage, status, photographs, or the person standing beside power. It belongs to every woman who needed a door opened when the world told her to wait outside." A woman near the scholarship table wiped her eyes. Margaret lowered her gaze. Preston looked at Eleanor as if he was seeing, too late, the person whose grace he had mistaken for permission. Celeste stood without the crown, her hands empty against her pale pink gown, her earlier words returning to the room without anyone needing to repeat them. Eleanor continued, "Tonight, I accept this honor on behalf of the women this foundation serves, and the people who keep showing up when no camera is turned toward them." She paused, then reached up with both hands and removed the tiara. The room inhaled. She did not hand it to Preston. She did not look at Celeste. She turned to Margaret and placed the crown back into the navy velvet box. "Let it remain with the foundation," Eleanor said. "No woman should have to wear a crown to prove she matters." Margaret closed the box with a soft click that sounded final beneath the chandeliers. Eleanor stepped away from the podium as the applause began again, but she did not stay to bathe in it. She walked down the steps slowly, passing the sponsor wall, the white roses, the guests who now made room for her without being asked. Preston moved toward her when she reached the edge of the ballroom. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, stripped of polish. She paused, not fully turning. "You let her try on my honor," she said. "But honor is not something another woman can wear if a man hands it to her." Preston had no answer. Celeste looked away first. Eleanor walked toward the rain-lit entrance, her head bare, her shoulders straight, leaving the crown in its rightful box and the ballroom behind her. She did not leave as someone dethroned. She left as someone who had never needed permission to be queen.